They forced her to wear another woman's ring. They dressed her in a gown that was not hers, whispered vows she did not choose, and laid beside her a man who called himself husband, but treated her like possession. On a plantation where silence was law, and graves were dug before the bodies ever cooled, one name was carved too deep in stone. Miriam. They said she was married to her master's son, but in truth she was wed to death itself and buried beside the bride who came before. The plantation sat heavy on the land, its white walls glowing pale against fields dark with hunger, a house that looked like it had been built to trap both air and memory. Miriam carried water from the well that morning, her hands raw from rope and iron, but it was not the weight of labor that hollowed her chest, it was the grave. She had seen it once, beyond the family plot where the master's kin lay in neat rows beneath carved stone. A single mound stood apart, not new but not yet settled, with a name she had never spoken aloud etched into the marker. Clara. They said Clara was the wife of Elias, the son who would inherit everything, though whispers from the quarters said she had not been his bride for long. Some claimed sickness, others spoke of madness, but Miriam had heard the older women say that Clara had screamed on her last night until her throat broke. Elias had not left his room since, and when he did, his eyes searched the fields like he was already hunting another soul. The housekeeper called Miriam to bring a tray to the parlor, and though her feet dragged, she obeyed. Inside, the air pressed close, thick with smoke and perfume, and there upon the mantel hung the portrait of Clara. Her painted face was too pale, her lips too thin, but her eyes dark, glistening, unblinking, fixed themselves on Miriam, as though they had been waiting for her. She felt a coldness in her chest, like fingers pressing against her ribs. Behind her, Elias cleared his throat, the sound brittle as dry wood. "You'll serve in this house now," he said, his voice neither kind nor cruel, only empty. She lowered her gaze, but still felt the weight of the portrait's eyes. Later, when she returned to the quarters, she told no one of the shiver that lingered, the way her skin seemed touched by dirt, though she had carried none. That night, she dreamed of the grave again, only this time it bore two names, carved side by side, as if the earth had already written its promise. Elias walked the halls of the plantation house like a man half alive, his boots striking wood that groaned as though beneath some greater weight. The slaves avoided his gaze, for there was something in his eyes that made the flesh tremble. Not fury exactly, but an emptiness that could swallow anything placed before it. Miriam carried bread and water to the dining room at dawn, her steps careful, her breath shallow, and when she entered, she found Elias seated at the head of the long oak table. Before him lay a cup of untouched wine, and beside it a folded handkerchief stained faintly with brown. His fingers toyed with a silver knife, tracing the edge as if the metal could stir some feeling from him. He did not look at her until she set the bread down, and when he did, his lips curled into something that was neither smile nor sneer. "You've seen her grave," he said, his voice low but certain. Miriam froze, her hands hovering over the tray. Unsure if speaking would summon punishment, she lowered her eyes, but Elias continued, the knife still in his hand. "Clara, my wife, you've seen where she rests. Do not think I don't know what the fields whisper." He rose suddenly, the chair scraping against the floorboards, and walked past Miriam, brushing her sleeve with his coat. The touch felt like ice, though the morning sun poured through the windows. He moved to the portrait in the parlor and touched the edge of the canvas with reverence, whispering words Miriam could not hear. His shoulders shook, but whether from grief or madness, she could not tell. That night, in the quarters, the women muttered in low voices about the son of the master. Some said Clara's death had not been illness, that Elias had taken her by force until her body broke beneath the strain. Others whispered that Clara had poisoned herself, preferring the silence of the grave to his bed. Miriam sat in the corner, head bowed, yet she could not stop the echo of his words from circling her mind. He had spoken of Clara's grave as if it were a room in his house, a place he could visit at will. She thought of the dirt piled neatly, of the name carved so deep, and of the second space waiting beside it like an open mouth. That night, Miriam dreamed again, But it was no ordinary dream. She stood in the parlor, beneath the gaze of Clara's painted eyes, and the portrait began to weep. The tears were black as ink, dripping down the frame, staining the floor, and when Miriam looked at her own hands, she found them covered in soil. From the earth came a voice, soft, hoarse, and certain, whispering that she would join the first wife soon, that two brides could share the same grave if the living wished it so. She woke with a cry muffled into her blanket, and outside the quarters the plantation bell rang, though no hand had touched the rope. The morning sun burned pale through the mist, and Miriam was summoned to the great house before her chores in the fields were done. The summons itself was unusual, for the master's son rarely addressed the quarters directly, but the overseer's voice carried no doubt when he said Elias wanted her dressed and brought inside. Her stomach coiled, though she knew better than to protest. She followed silently, her feet dragging through the dew, the smell of damp earth clinging to her. Within the parlor, the curtains were drawn tight, dimming the room to a kind of hushed twilight. Elias sat near the fireplace, though no fire burned, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on her with a hunger that was not desire, but something stranger, more possessive. On the table beside him rested a folded length of white linen, a veil, and a ring that gleamed faintly in the half-light. "It is decided," he said without preamble, his words rolling out heavy, as if he repeated them from someone else's mouth. "You will be my wife." Miriam's breath caught sharp in her chest, but she did not speak. Her tongue seemed to turn to stone, and silence was safer than the truth of her terror. Elias rose slowly, taking the ring in his hand, and stepped closer until she could smell the sour wine clinging to his breath. He lifted her hand roughly, sliding the ring upon her finger. It hung too loose, clattering against her knuckle as though it refused to belong. Miriam trembled, and the room trembled with her. From the mantel above, Clara's portrait gazed down, her painted mouth curved in the faintest suggestion of pity or warning. For a moment, Miriam thought she saw the eyes glisten, catching a light that was not present, as though the dead wife bore witness to this second marriage. Outside in the hall, the housekeeper's steps echoed, and a whisper reached Miriam's ear that did not belong to any living tongue. It said, "One ring, two graves." Elias tightened his grip until her fingers ached, and then released her with sudden gentleness, as though the ceremony was complete with only his decree. He ordered the veil to be draped over her hair, and in that moment Miriam felt herself vanish, erased beneath cloth and command, transformed into something that was neither servant nor bride, but a vessel for silence. She returned to the quarters with the ring still cold upon her hand, and the women stared with wide eyes but dared not speak. In the corner, the elder, known as Aunt Ruth, muttered prayers beneath her breath, shaking her head slowly. That night, Miriam lay awake on her mat, the veil folded beside her, and each time she closed her eyes, she saw Clara's face hovering above her, lips moving soundlessly. Just before sleep claimed her, she understood what they were saying. It was not welcome. It was not warning. It was a promise that when the second wife was buried, she would not be buried alone. The wedding was no wedding at all, but a shadow of ritual stitched together with silence and command. They gathered in the parlor at dusk, the lamps lit, though the windows still held the last color of day, their dim glow casting long fingers of shadow across the floor. Elias stood stiff before the hearth, his coat pressed and his hair slicked, his pale hands restless at his sides. Miriam was led in, wearing a borrowed gown of yellowed lace, the fabric frayed at the seams and too loose at the shoulders. The veil was draped across her hair, hiding the shame in her eyes, but no veil could soften the weight of the ring that burned against her finger. No minister was summoned, no scripture read aloud. The master himself presided, his voice carrying the solemnity of business more than of blessing. He declared, Elias and Miriam joined, though his words sounded more like a binding of ownership than any holy vow. The other slaves were forced to stand along the walls, silent witnesses pressed into service as congregation, their eyes lowered, though their hearts burned with unspoken horror. Miriam felt every gaze upon her, some pitying, some frightened, and some resigned to the cruelty of the moment. As Elias reached to take her hand, the room seemed to darken, as though the very walls recoiled. From the corner, the portrait of Clara glimmered in the lamplight, her painted eyes watching with an intensity that made Miriam's skin prickle. She thought she saw the mouth curve slightly, neither smile nor frown, but a twist that suggested she too bore witness to this twisted ceremony. When Elias placed his lips against Miriam's knuckles, the touch was cold and perfunctory, and a shudder passed through her bones. The master nodded with satisfaction, declaring the union sealed, and the housekeeper clapped her hands once, sharp and hollow, as though to mark the end. There was no feast, no music, no celebration, only the scraping of chairs and the shuffle of feet as the household dispersed, leaving behind the taste of something rotten in the air. That night, Miriam was taken to the master's son's chamber, the bridal chamber in name only, its walls hung with heavy curtains that smothered every sound. The bed loomed before her, draped in sheets that smelled faintly of lavender and dust, and upon the bedside table rested a small framed likeness of Clara, her image more vibrant than the man who claimed to love her. Elias stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed not on Miriam but on the portrait, as though he sought his first wife's approval for what was about to pass. Miriam's breath came shallow, her heart clawing against her chest, and though her body remained still, her spirit screamed. When Elias reached for her, she closed her eyes, and in the darkness she saw earth falling, heavy and final, upon a grave not yet dug but waiting, always waiting for her name to be carved beside another. The nights that followed were steeped in dread, for Miriam lay in the bridal chamber as though entombed, her body beside Elias, yet her soul hovering elsewhere. She did not sleep easily, for every time her eyes closed, the sound of shifting earth returned to her ears, the weight of dirt pressing against her chest, though no hand touched her. Elias tossed and turned, muttering in his sleep, sometimes whispering Clara's name, as though summoning her back into the flesh. Once Miriam woke to find him sitting upright, his eyes wide open yet unseeing, his hands reaching toward the empty corner where the shadows gathered thickest. When she spoke his name, he did not stir, only pressed a finger to his lips as though shushing some unseen presence. By morning, he recalled nothing, his face drawn pale, his hands trembling as he forced bread past his lips. Miriam kept silent, but each night the same restlessness took him, and each night she felt a greater weight pressing upon her. The house seemed no kinder in daylight. The parlor smelled of smoke even when the hearth lay cold, and the portrait of Clara remained a sentinel above the mantel, its eyes dark pools that held more life than the man who had once claimed her. Miriam swore that sometimes the painted head turned slightly, following her across the room, though she never saw it move. Once she passed by and found a faint smear beneath one painted eye, like a tear that had been brushed away in haste. In the quarters, whispers grew louder. The slaves muttered that the son had bound himself to death by marrying a second time so soon that no union blessed by blood and cruelty could last. Aunt Ruth shook her head and told Miriam to keep her prayers strong, for the grave was greedy when it was invited to supper. Miriam dared not confess the chill she felt whenever Elias touched her, the sense that his skin no longer carried heat of its own, but borrowed from her unwilling body. On the fifth night she woke with dirt beneath her nails, though she had not touched the earth. Her mouth tasted of soil, bitter and damp, and when she stumbled to the wash basin, her reflection wavered. In the glass, she saw not her own tired eyes but Clara's, staring back with pity so sharp it felt like cruelty. Elias stirred then, his voice raw, and called her by the dead woman's name. Miriam fled into the hall, pressing her back against the wall, the veil of borrowed lace slipping from her hair. She did not cry, for tears seemed too human for what she endured. Instead, she listened to the silence of the house, a silence broken only by a faint scraping beneath the floorboards, as though someone below was clawing at the wood, desperate to rise. And though she knew it could not be, Miriam pressed her hand against the wall and whispered a name not her own, half fearing, half knowing that it might answer back. The days blurred into one another, each hour thick with dread, until Miriam no longer knew if she walked the earth of the living or the shadow of the dead. The master's son kept her close, commanding her presence in the parlor, at his table, and always within reach of his restless hands. He spoke often of Clara, recounting her virtues in a voice that quavered between longing and rage, as if his memory itself had turned poisonous. Miriam sat silent, forced to listen as he praised his first wife's beauty, her manners, her voice, words that made the air itself grow heavy. Yet, when she glanced at the portrait above the mantel, she thought she saw sorrow carved deeper into Clara's painted face, as though the canvas knew the torment he inflicted. One evening, as the sun drowned behind the trees and left the plantation cloaked in red light, Ilias demanded Miriam wear the dead wife's gown. It hung loose upon her frame, the sleeves falling past her wrists, the bodice sagging, as though rejecting the shape of a body not meant to fill it. He fastened the buttons himself, each click sharp as a nail hammered into wood. Miriam's throat tightened until breathing felt like a sin, but she obeyed, for obedience was survival. When Elias led her into the dining room, he poured wine into a crystal glass and pushed it toward her lips, whispering that Clara had once sipped from the same cup. Miriam held it, but did not drink, the scent alone making her stomach twist. Across the table, the shadows deepened, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw another figure seated there, the outline of a woman in white, her head bowed, her hands folded like a corpse laid out for burial. Elias raised his glass to that empty seat, toasting the silence with a trembling hand. That night, Miriam returned to the chamber with the gown still clinging to her skin, its fabric whispering against her body like dry leaves. She lay stiff upon the bed as Ilias collapsed beside her, muttering Clara's name in his sleep. The air grew colder as the hours passed, and Miriam's eyes fixed upon the mirror across the room. In the dim light, it reflected not her still body, but a coffin lined with white satin, and within it, both Clara and herself, lying side by side with their hands entwined. She bit her lip until blood filled her mouth, hoping pain would wake her, but the vision did not fade. When the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, Miriam rose in silence, her gown heavy with the scent of dust and earth. She stripped it from her body and folded it carefully, leaving it at the foot of the bed. Her hands shook as she whispered a prayer that felt more like surrender than plea, for she knew then what the elders had always warned, that once a grave has opened for one wife, it will not close until it has claimed the second. The morning carried no warmth, though the sun hung heavy above the fields, its light falling flat against the soil, as if even the day feared to linger. Miriam walked with a basket upon her arm, sent to gather herbs from the garden behind the house. Her steps faltered when she reached the edge of the path, for beyond the rows of rosemary and sage lay the family burial ground, the stones standing crooked like teeth gnawed down by time. She had passed the place before, but never so close, and the air seemed to press thicker the nearer she came. Her eyes found Clara's marker, the letters carved deep as wounds, and beside it the raw earth of a second plot, freshly turned, though no body lay within. The soil looked restless, as though it had been stirred in the night. Miriam knelt, her hands trembling as she plucked at the herbs, but her gaze could not leave that mound of earth waiting patiently for her. A shadow fell over her, and she turned to find Aunt Ruth standing there, her face lined with sorrow, her eyes sharp with warning. "Child," she whispered, her voice low enough that the wind nearly swallowed it, "they digging your rest before your time." Miriam swallowed hard, her throat dry, and dared to ask what she had never spoken. "Why me?" Aunt Ruth's lips pressed tight, and after a long silence she said, "Because the dead don't let go when they ain't finished, and the living don't stop when they think they own you. You caught between both." Miriam felt the basket grow heavy in her arms, though she had gathered little, and when she looked back toward the stones, she thought she saw movement, the faint rise of breath from the mound of earth, as though the grave itself exhaled. That night she lay awake, the whispers of the quarters carrying through the dark, the women murmuring prayers meant to keep spirits at bay. Miriam pressed the ring upon her finger, wishing it would fall loose again, but it clung tighter than before, biting into her skin like iron. Sleep finally took her, and with it came the dream. She stood once more at the burial ground, the moon swollen above her, and saw Clara rise from the earth, her gown torn and stained, her eyes hollow but alive with fury. Beside her, the empty grave yawned open, and Miriam felt hands at her back, pushing her toward it. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her chest, smothered by soil already filling her lungs. She awoke, gasping, her nails cutting crescents into her palms, and found dirt scattered across her blanket, though she had not left the chamber. Elias stirred beside her, murmuring Clara's name, and in that half-light, Miriam realized the truth that chilled her blood. The grave did not wait for death to claim her. It was already reaching into the house, clawing through her dreams, preparing her place beside the first wife before her body had even stilled. The house grew stranger with every passing day, as though the walls themselves had begun to shift in quiet rebellion. Doors opened where no draught stirred, and curtains swelled outward like lungs taking breath, though the air was still. Miriam carried a tray through the hallway one afternoon when she heard soft weeping from behind the locked nursery door. The sound was so faint she first thought it the wind, but as she drew closer, it sharpened into the cry of a woman, low and broken, begging for silence. Her hand hovered above the latch, though she knew it would not open, for the nursery had been sealed since Clara's death. Still, the cries seeped into her bones, and she pressed her ear against the wood, only to hear her own name whispered from within. She fled down the stairs, the tray rattling in her hands, her breath uneven. In the parlor, Elias sat slumped in a chair, a bottle at his side, his eyes red as if he too had been weeping. He asked where she had been, his tone sharp, and when she faltered he rose and struck the tray from her hands, the bread scattering across the rug. His voice softened then, almost tender, as he called her Clara and begged her to forgive him. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest, her lips trembling with words she dared not release. That night she crept into the hall again, compelled by a force she could not name. The nursery door stood ajar this time, though no hand had opened it, and the faint glow of moonlight slipped across the floorboards. She pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, yet the scent of lavender lingered, as though someone had rocked a child here only hours before. A cradle rested in the corner, its wood polished smooth by long use, and within it lay a folded blanket embroidered with the name Clara. Miriam reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric, when the cradle began to rock gently, as if stirred by an unseen hand. Her breath caught, and she backed away, her heels striking the doorframe. In that moment, a figure appeared in the mirror across the room, a pale woman in a wedding gown, her face obscured by a veil, her arms cradling something small. Miriam stared, frozen, until the woman lifted her head, and beneath the veil there was no face, only a mouth filled with soil that spilled onto the floor. Miriam fled, her heart hammering, and when she reached the safety of the chamber, she collapsed upon the bed, trembling. Elias stirred beside her, murmuring Clara's name once more. Miriam buried her face in her hands, unable to tell where the living ended and the dead began, for the house no longer belonged to either. It belonged only to the silence that grew heavier each night, the silence that carried her name within it, like a vow. That night, Miriam dreamed of earth again, but this time the grave was not waiting in the distance. It was beneath her feet, pulling at her body as though she were already lying in it. She awoke with a start, her skin damp, the sheets twisted around her legs, and Elias's breath sour beside her. His hand twitched even in sleep, fingers curling as though clutching something invisible. She tried to slip from the bed, but his grip caught her wrist, and when his eyes opened, they were glazed, unfocused, like a man still lost in the dream world. He whispered Clara's name, not hers, and pulled her against him, his lips brushing her ear with a coldness that made her shiver. Miriam forced herself still, praying his hold would slacken. At last he turned away, his body shaking, and she crept into the hallway. The house breathed with her, floorboards sighing beneath her steps, shadows folding like wings along the walls. Drawn by a sound she could not name, she found herself once more in the parlor. The portrait hung in its usual place, but the lamplight made the painted surface glisten as though the oils had not yet dried. Clara's eyes gleamed with a wetness that seemed alive. Miriam felt compelled to speak, her lips parting against her will. "Why me?" she whispered. The silence answered with a sharp creak, and the floor gave way under her step. She stumbled, catching herself against the hearth, and in that moment she saw something impossible. The rug before the fire bulged upward, as though earth pressed from beneath. A smell of fresh soil filled the room, damp and raw, and she swore she heard the faint sound of shovels striking dirt. She backed away, her heart hammering, when a sudden crash split the silence. The ring slipped from her finger, striking the floor with a metallic clang. She stooped to snatch it up, but before her hand closed around it, she saw another hand, pale, slender, with fingernails caked in soil reaching from beneath the rug to claim it first. Miriam gasped and pulled back, clutching the ring to her chest, her breath torn ragged in her throat. She fled to the chamber, her bare feet pounding the boards. But when she slipped beneath the covers, Elias turned to her, his face pale as candle wax. "She wants you with her," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep or madness. She could not tell. Miriam stared at him, frozen, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. He spoke again, softer this time, almost tender. The grave beside hers. "It's yours." She pressed her eyes shut, fighting tears. But when she opened them again, the room seemed smaller, the ceiling lower, the air heavy with earth. It was as if the house itself was sinking, lowering them all into the ground. And in the stillness between Elias's shallow breaths, she heard it again, the faintest sound of soil shifting, the whisper of her name carried upward from beneath the floor. The elder slaves had long warned that the master's blood carried more than cruelty, that it carried a curse stitched into every union, and now Miriam began to understand. She rose at dawn with the others, her body weary from a night that felt more like burial than sleep, and found Aunt Ruth waiting by the well. The old woman's eyes, clouded yet sharp, met hers with a weight that made Miriam's throat tighten. Without words, Ruth pressed a small bundle into her hands, a scrap of cloth tied with red thread, inside of which lay a pinch of salt and a twist of sage. "Keep it close," she whispered, her voice like brittle reeds in the wind. "It may not keep death away, but it will keep you whole until it comes." Miriam tucked it into the pocket of her apron, feeling its fragile weight, as though it were the only barrier between her and the grave that stalked her. That evening she was summoned again to the house. Elias paced the parlor, his hair disheveled, his eyes feverish, and the portrait of Clara loomed above him with a gaze darker than ever. He demanded Miriam sit before him, his voice cracking as he raved about promises and vows, about the grave that bound them all. He seized her wrist and pressed her palm flat against the table, muttering that her skin was too warm, too alive, when Clara's touch had always been cool as stone. Miriam trembled, her breath ragged, and he leaned close, his lips brushing her cheek as he whispered, "You will not outlive her. None of them do." The words settled into her bones like nails hammered into a coffin lid. That night, Miriam lay awake in the chamber, clutching the bundle of salt and sage as though it might anchor her to the living world. Yet, when her eyes drifted closed, she found herself once more at the burial ground. The moon shone sharp upon the stones, and there stood Clara, her gown torn and soiled, her mouth whispering Miriam's name. Behind her, the second grave gaped wider, its edges crumbling like a wound that would not close. Miriam tried to run, but her feet sank into the earth, and from the soil rose hands, thin and pale, dragging her downward. She woke, gasping, her nails bloody from clawing at the sheets, and in the half-light, Elias sat watching her, his face unreadable. On the table beside the bed lay the ring she had worn, but now it was blackened, as though scorched by fire. Elias lifted it slowly and slid it back onto her finger, his eyes never leaving hers. "It knows you now," he said softly. Miriam shuddered, feeling the metal bite into her flesh, colder than iron, heavier than bone. She turned her face away, but in the dark she knew the truth. Aunt Ruth had spoken. No wife in that house was ever meant to see old age, for the soil had already chosen its place, and the grave was patient. The hallway mirror had always troubled Miriam, for it hung tall and wide near the staircase, its gilt frame dulled by dust, its glass warped with age. She avoided it when she could, bowing her head as she passed, but on that evening Elias stopped her with a hand upon her arm. His grip was firm, and his eyes glittered with the same fever that had grown sharper each day. He led her before the mirror and forced her to stand still, his fingers digging into her shoulder. "Look," he commanded, his breath hot and uneven. Miriam raised her eyes reluctantly, and what she saw made her knees weaken. In the glass she stood beside Elias, but her own reflection was not wholly hers. The veil she had worn at the mock wedding lay draped across her head in the reflection, though in truth her hair was uncovered. And where her face should have been pale with fear, another face pressed against hers, blurred but unmistakable, the features of Clara, eyes hollow yet burning, lips moving in a soundless vow. Elias pressed his palm flat against the mirror, his voice thick with longing as he whispered, "She approves. She blesses us." Miriam shook her head, her heart clawing to escape her chest, but he tightened his grip until her bones ached. "Do not deny her," he growled. "She watches, she listens, she binds us all." The reflection seemed to ripple then, as though the glass were water, and for a moment Miriam felt a cold hand brush hers, though only Elias's grip held her in place. She tore her gaze away and stumbled back, clutching the scrap of salt and sage in her pocket, as though it might shield her from what she had seen. Elias released her with a hollow laugh, his eyes glinting with madness, and strode down the hall, muttering Clara's name as though it were prayer. Miriam remained before the mirror, trembling, her own reflection shifting back into place, yet the faint outline of Clara's face lingered in the corner of the glass, fading only when the shadows grew thicker. That night Miriam dreamt of standing once more before the mirror, her body draped in the dead wife's gown, her hand clasped tightly in another's. When she turned to see who held her, she found herself face to face with Clara, their fingers entwined as if bound by rings of earth. Together they stepped into the grave that opened wide beneath the mirror, and as Miriam sank into the soil, she felt the weight of Elias's gaze above them, watching, waiting, smiling, like a man who had at last united what life and death had separated. She woke, choking on the taste of dirt, her hand clasped around the blackened ring that pulsed cold against her finger. In the dim light, Elias slept beside her, murmuring promises to Clara, yet Miriam knew he no longer dreamed of the first wife alone. He dreamed of two brides bound together, reflections locked in a glass that showed no mercy. The cellar smelled of damp stone and mildew, a place the housekeeper rarely allowed the slaves to enter, yet Elias insisted Miriam follow him down its narrow steps one evening. A single lantern swung in his hand, casting long shadows that writhed against the walls like restless spirits. At the bottom, the air grew colder, and Miriam felt her skin prickle, as if the earth itself pressed too close. Elias led her to an old chest tucked beneath the stairwell, its wood swollen with age, its iron latch rusted but unbroken. With a grunt, he forced it open, and the lid groaned like a coffin pried from the grave. Inside lay a heap of yellowed fabric, lace browned with time, and the faint scent of lavender clinging stubbornly to rot. He reached in and drew out a wedding gown, its bodice stiff with forgotten sweat, the hem darkened as though dragged through soil. Miriam staggered back, her breath catching in her throat, for she recognized it from the portrait that hung above the mantel. It was Clara's gown, preserved like relic or offering, waiting for a body that would never wear it again. Elias held it up with trembling hands, his eyes glistening with a fevered devotion. "She wore this when she came to me," he whispered, pressing the fabric to his face. "And now it will be yours." Miriam's knees weakened, her body screaming to flee, yet her feet held fast to the stone floor. The gown swayed in his grip, its lace stirring as though alive, and in the wavering lantern light she thought she saw stains upon it, not of soil, but of dried blood, smeared along the seams like the memory of violence. Elias draped the gown over her shoulders, the fabric cold and heavy, smelling of death more than perfume. The sleeves slipped past her hands, shrouding her like burial cloth, and she felt the weight of the dead wife pressing against her skin. A whisper rose from the dark corners of the cellar, faint yet clear, a woman's voice murmuring her name with dreadful tenderness. Miriam tore the gown from her body and cast it to the floor, her chest heaving, but Elias only laughed, his eyes wild. He scooped the fabric back into his arms, rocking it as though it were child or bride, muttering words of devotion that chilled her blood. Miriam fled up the stairs, the lantern light fading behind her, and burst into the hallway, gasping for air. She leaned against the wall, her hands trembling, but when she looked down, she saw threads of lace clinging stubbornly to her skin, thin as cobwebs, impossible to brush away. That night she dreamed of lying in a coffin, lined with Clara's gown, the lace wrapping her wrists and ankles, binding her so tightly she could not move. Beside her, another body rested, silent and cold, its face hidden by a veil. She woke, screaming into the darkness, but no one answered, only the house itself breathing slow and heavy, as though preparing the earth for her at last. The days turned heavy with heat, yet Miriam felt only a coldness that would not leave her bones. She moved through the house like a shadow, her hands trembling each time Elias called her near. It was then she began to notice her body had changed, her stomach tightening, her breath coming shorter, the faint stir of new life moving within her. The truth struck her with the force of iron. She carried the child of the master's son. Word spread quickly through the quarters, for nothing could be hidden among the enslaved. Some wept softly for her, others turned their faces away in dread, and Aunt Ruth alone dared to speak. "That seed ain't blessed," she whispered, her voice brittle but sure. "It carries death's mark, and it will not cry with a living tongue." Miriam pressed her hand to her belly at night, lying awake beside Elias, and dreamed of a cradle rocking in the nursery. Yet when she peered into it, she found not a child but soil, dark and wet, writhing with worms that twisted like fingers. In her dream she reached down, and the soil clung to her hands, pulling her deeper until she could not free herself. She awoke, gasping, her palms smeared with black dirt, though she had not touched the ground. Elias grew more fevered with her condition, speaking to her belly as though Clara listened through the child. He pressed his lips to her skin, whispering promises that chilled her more than any threat. "She will return through you," he said, his eyes shining with madness. "Clara will be born again, and this house will know peace." Miriam turned away, clutching the bundle of salt and sage Aunt Ruth had given her, though its strength felt thinner by the day. At meals, Elias spoke only of Clara, never of Miriam, as though the child was not her flesh, but the dead wife's gift. One evening, he forced her to stand before the portrait, his hand heavy upon her shoulder, declaring to the painted woman that their union had not been broken, only reborn. Miriam's knees buckled beneath the weight of his words, her heart hammering with terror. That night, as thunder rolled beyond the fields, she felt the child stir inside her, but the movement was wrong, sharp and cold, as though claws raked her from within. She cried out, but Elias only smiled, holding her tightly as she trembled. In the silence that followed the storm, she thought she heard a lullaby drifting from the locked nursery, a soft, mournful tune sung by a voice not of this world. She pressed her ear to the door and nearly collapsed when the song broke off, and a whisper called her name. Her hand clutched her belly as dread washed over her. She knew then what Aunt Ruth had meant. This child was not life. It was a promise of death, a thread binding her to the grave already waiting, and each breath she took brought her closer to lying beside the first wife in the soil that never loosened its hold. The summer air pressed heavy against the land, yet the burial ground seemed colder than any shadow. Miriam's steps faltered as Elias led her past the crooked stones one evening, his hand clamped around her wrist like iron. He spoke little, his mouth twitching with fevered thoughts, until they reached Clara's grave. The earth had settled into a smooth mound, its marker carved deep, the letters sharp even in the fading light. Beside it, however, the soil was raw, freshly disturbed, as though someone had worked it with a shovel only hours before. Miriam froze, her stomach twisting, for she knew at once what it meant. Elias stood tall, his eyes gleaming with something wild. "It must be ready," he said softly, almost tenderly. "No wife should ever lie alone. Clara waits, and you will not deny her." His words sank into Miriam, like nails driven into her coffin before it was built. She shook her head, unable to speak, but Elias pressed her hand against the raw earth until her fingers sank into the dirt. It was damp and cool, clinging to her skin like breath. She pulled back with a cry, but he only smiled, whispering that vows were not complete until the grave was prepared. The air grew heavy, and Miriam thought she saw the mound of Clara's grave shift, a faint quiver, as if something beneath had stirred. Her knees buckled, and she fell against the grass, clutching her belly, where the child twisted sharply inside her. Elias bent low, his shadow long across her body, and pressed his lips to her ear. "When the time comes, you will lie here beside her, and the child will bind you both forever." His voice broke then, half sob and half laughter, and he turned away, leaving Miriam kneeling in the dirt. She scrambled back to the quarters that night, her hands still stained, her breath shuddering. The women gathered around her, their faces grim, their voices low. Aunt Ruth laid a hand upon her shoulder, whispering prayers older than scripture, prayers that smelled of smoke and salt and sorrow. Miriam clutched the elder's hand, tears streaking her face, and begged to know if there was any way to undo what had been set in motion. Ruth only shook her head, her eyes hollow with truth. "Child, the earth don't lie. A grave dug is a grave promised." That night, Miriam dreamed of the burial ground once more. She stood between the two mounds, the soil rising like waves around her. Clara's pale hand broke through the dirt, reaching upward, and from the second grave came a smaller hand, thin and sharp, clutching at her gown. She screamed and woke gasping, the room heavy with the scent of soil. When she lit the lamp, she saw footprints of dirt across the chamber floor, leading from the door to the foot of her bed, where they ended as though someone had stood watching her in the dark until dawn. The night carried a stillness too sharp to be natural, as though every insect and bird had been warned into silence. Miriam lay restless on the bed, Elias already sunk into drunken sleep beside her, when the sound came. At first, she thought it was her heart beating too loudly, but soon she knew it for what it was, the toll of a bell. Once, then again, the sound rolling through the house, though no church stood within miles. The air grew cold, her breath visible in the darkness, and she pressed her hands against her belly as the child stirred, restless beneath her ribs. The bell tolled a third time, though softer, as if muffled by soil. Miriam rose, her bare feet silent upon the floorboards, and stepped into the hallway. The house seemed changed, its walls pulsing with shadow, the stairwell stretching longer than she remembered. She followed the sound until she reached the locked nursery door. From within came the faint cry of an infant, thin and pained, accompanied by the low hum of a woman's voice. Miriam pressed her forehead to the wood, her tears hot against the cold surface, whispering prayers she did not know she still remembered. The door trembled beneath her hands, and for a moment she thought it might open, but then the bell tolled once more, and the nursery fell silent. She fled down the stairs into the parlor, where the portrait of Clara loomed above the hearth. In the dim glow of the dying lamp, Miriam swore she saw the painted woman's lips moving. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, and heard a whisper coil from the canvas, soft and cruel. "Not long now." The words broke her strength, and she collapsed to her knees, clutching her swollen belly as waves of dread rolled over her. Elias's footsteps thundered down the hall behind her, his face twisted with fury, his eyes wide with madness. He dragged her upright, demanding to know why she had left the chamber, and when she stammered of the bell and the voice, he struck her across the cheek with the back of his hand. "It is Clara," he snarled, spittle shining on his lips. "She calls, and you will answer. Do you hear her? She will have you beside her, and the child too. She will not lie alone." His words echoed with such conviction that Miriam believed them more than she feared them. He shoved her back toward the stairs, muttering Clara's name with each step, and left her trembling in the chamber once more. She lay in the dark, her cheek throbbing, the taste of iron on her tongue, and listened as the bell tolled again faintly in the distance. This time it rang, not for the dead, but for the living who had already been promised to the grave. She pressed her palm to her belly, whispering to the unborn child, though she knew the truth deep within her. The bell was not tolling for birth, but for burial, and its sound would not cease until earth closed over them both. The storm came without warning, a roar of thunder that shook the rafters, and a blaze of lightning that split the sky wide above the fields. Rain lashed the windows of the great house, but inside the air was hotter than fire, thick with the smell of sweat and wine. Miriam sat rigid in the corner of the chamber, her hands folded tight over her belly, while Elias paced like a caged animal, his face flushed and his eyes wild. He shouted Clara's name as though she lingered in the storm, his voice cracking until it no longer sounded human. When Miriam tried to rise, he seized her arm and dragged her into the parlor. The portrait glared down at them, the eyes shining eerily in the flare of lightning, and Elias hurled his glass at the wall, shattering wine across the floor like spilled blood. He screamed that Clara watched, that she judged, that she demanded Miriam's obedience as proof of devotion. His rage grew so violent that the floor seemed to tremble, and the thunder outside answered his cries like a drumbeat of doom. He shoved Miriam to her knees before the painting, gripping her hair until her neck ached, forcing her to stare at Clara's face. "Kneel to her," he hissed, his breath sour with liquor. "You are nothing without her blessing. You are nothing but the shadow of her grave." Miriam closed her eyes, but the weight of his hand was unbearable, and she whispered a prayer that was neither to Clara nor to heaven, but to any power that might let her live another night. The storm rattled the windows so fiercely that one shattered, wind and rain pouring in, extinguishing the lamp and leaving them in near darkness. In that moment, the portrait slipped from the wall and crashed to the floor. The canvas split, the frame splintering, and for an instant Miriam saw not paint but flesh. Clara's pale face pressed against the torn cloth, her lips opening in a soundless scream. Elias staggered back, his rage crumbling into terror, his hands shaking as though he too had seen it. He fell to his knees, sobbing, calling Clara's name, begging forgiveness. Miriam crawled to the corner, clutching her belly, her body trembling with cold despite the storm's heat. She knew then that the house itself had turned against them, its walls bending beneath the weight of the dead. When the storm at last subsided, Elias lay collapsed upon the floor, his chest heaving, his eyes staring blank at the broken portrait. Miriam returned to the chamber alone, her cheek bruised, her heart pounding. She tried to rest, but each time her eyes closed, she heard the echo of the canvas splitting and saw again the face of the first wife, tearing through paint and frame to claim her place. And though the storm had passed, the air still reeked of earth and iron, as though the house itself had already begun to bury them both alive. The silence after the storm was worse than the thunder itself, a heavy stillness that seemed to press against Miriam's chest until she could scarcely breathe. The days dragged, each one longer than the last, and the air in the house thickened with dread. Her body ached beneath the weight of the child, though deep in her bones she knew no life stirred within her, only a promise of death. At night Elias slept fitfully, muttering Clara's name, while Miriam lay awake staring at the ceiling, her hands pressed against her belly, feeling only emptiness despite the swell. On the seventh night after the storm, she woke to the sound of wood creaking in the nursery above. The cradle rocked without pause, its rhythm steady as breath. She rose slowly, her bare feet cold against the floor, and followed the sound into the hall. The door, which had been locked for months, now stood ajar. Moonlight spilled across the threshold, illuminating the cradle within. It swayed gently, as though an unseen hand soothed the child inside. Miriam stepped closer, her heart pounding, and peered over the edge. What she saw hollowed her lungs with horror. The cradle held no child, only a small mound of soil writhing with worms. From within the dirt came a faint cry, high and thin, the sound of an infant whose lungs had never drawn air. Miriam staggered back, her hand pressed to her mouth, but the cry followed, rising until it filled the room, a chorus of mourning too sharp for ears to bear. She fled to the stairs, but halfway down, she met Elias. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, his face slack with a kind of terrible joy. "She has come," he whispered. "She has returned through you." He gripped her arm and pulled her toward the parlor, where the shattered portrait still lay across the floor. He forced her to kneel before it, pressing her hand against her belly, his voice shaking with frenzy. "Clara has given us a child. Even the grave cannot keep her away." Miriam tried to speak, but her words died in her throat, drowned by the echo of the cradle's cries that still rang in her ears. Elias laughed, a sound raw and broken, and pressed his forehead against hers. His breath was cold, reeking of wine and madness, and he whispered, "Tomorrow we will take her to the grave where she belongs." Miriam's blood ran to ice, for she understood then that he meant to bury not only her unborn child, but herself as well, to seal them beside Clara in the earth. That night she returned to the chamber, trembling, unable to close her eyes. When at last exhaustion overtook her, she dreamed of the burial ground once more. Both graves lay open now, side by side, their mouths gaping wide, and from the darkness of the soil came two voices, Clara's, and that of a child unborn, calling her name in unison, demanding she join them before dawn. The house had grown sick with shadows, every corner thick with the sense of watching eyes. Miriam moved through its halls with her shoulders bent, her body heavy, her spirit hollowed by dread. Elias scarcely left her side now, his face gaunt, his hands trembling, though his grip on her was iron strong. He drank from morning to night, the smell of liquor bleeding from his skin, yet his voice grew clearer in its madness. He insisted Clara had returned, that she lingered in every room, that she walked beside Miriam like a sister no one else could see. One evening, as dusk settled and the sky burned with the last red of day, Miriam sat in the chamber, rocking slowly on the edge of the bed. She stared at her hands, dirt beneath her nails, though she had not touched the ground since morning. A sudden chill spread across the room, so sharp it stilled her breath, and when she lifted her eyes, she saw her. Clara stood at the foot of the bed, her gown pale as bone, her face veiled in lace torn and soiled. Her presence carried no sound of steps, only the rustle of cloth as though stirred by a grave wind. Elias rose to his knees at once, his eyes wet with rapture. "Clara," he whispered, his voice breaking like a boy's. "You have come." Miriam clutched her belly, her heart hammering against her ribs, for the figure's head turned toward her. Through the torn veil she glimpsed eyes hollow and glistening, not filled with sorrow but with hunger. The figure stretched out a hand, pale fingers, thin as bone, reaching not for Elias, but for her. Miriam's breath shuddered, and she pressed back against the headboard, but Elias caught her arm and pulled her forward. "She chooses you," he hissed, his nails digging into her skin. "She takes you into her keeping. Do you not see how blessed you are?" Miriam tried to cry out, but her voice shrank into silence. The room darkened, the air thick with the smell of soil and rot, and Clara's figure loomed closer until Miriam felt the brush of her veil across her cheek, damp and cold. Her belly twisted violently, pain shooting through her body, and she cried out at last, a raw sound that startled even Elias. Clara's form flickered like candlelight, wavering and then fading into shadow, leaving only the echo of her presence behind. Elias slumped against the bedpost, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with devotion. "She is with us," he whispered. "She will not be denied." Miriam curled into herself, trembling, her hands pressed against her belly as the child stirred within. Yet the movement did not feel alive. It felt cold, sharp, wrong, as though the grave itself had already reached through her flesh. The chamber filled with silence once more, but Miriam knew it was not peace. It was waiting, patient and merciless, for the earth does not hurry when it already knows it will claim what it has been promised. The air in the house thickened with a dread that clung like smoke, so dense Miriam felt it in her throat with every breath. Elias grew stranger by the day, moving like a man hollowed out and filled with another's will. He spoke less to her and more to the empty corners, lifting his glass in toasts to shadows, setting extra places at the long dining table. One evening, he ordered Miriam to dress in the dead wife's gown once more. The lace hung heavy and damp against her skin, the scent of mildew and lavender rising as if the fabric itself remembered the grave. She obeyed, for refusal meant blows, though her soul writhed beneath the weight of that cloth. Elias lit candles across the table, their flames wavering, though no wind stirred. He motioned for her to sit, and before them the chairs stood waiting, plates and goblets set neatly, though no living guests had been summoned. He raised his glass high, his voice trembling with both madness and reverence. "To Clara," he said, his eyes fixed on the head of the table, "to our eternal bride, and to the one who joins her." Miriam's hand shook so violently the goblet nearly slipped from her grasp. In the flicker of the candlelight, she thought she saw figures seated around the table, outlines faint but undeniable, the pale shimmer of faces, watching from behind the veil of death. She dropped her gaze, refusing to meet their hollow stares, yet she could feel them, a weight pressing upon her chest, a chill coiling through her veins. Elias laughed then, a sound sharp as breaking glass. "They come to witness," he said. "They come to bless the union, the second bride beside the first." His words rang with such certainty that Miriam felt her sanity waver. She clutched the small bundle of salt and sage Aunt Ruth had given her, praying silently, though her lips never moved. Still, the air grew colder, and the flames leaned toward her as though drawn to her body. When the bell tolled in the distance, one long, mournful note, every candle guttered at once, plunging the room into near darkness. Elias clutched her hand tightly, whispering that the vow was sealed, that the child within her was proof the grave had opened its arms. Miriam tore her hand free and fled into the hall, her breath ragged, the sound of laughter chasing her steps. She collapsed in the chamber, trembling, her gown tangled around her ankles. The house had become a church for the dead, its table set for those who no longer drew breath. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. For the first time, she knew with a terrible certainty that there was no life waiting for her beyond those walls. Only a grave beside a woman she had never met, a woman whose presence grew nearer each night. And in the silence that followed, she swore she heard Clara's voice at her ear, whispering welcome. The night was thick with heat, though no fire burned, the air in the chamber stifling, as though the house itself sought to smother Miriam. She lay rigid upon the bed, her eyes open wide to the darkness, while Elias paced the floor like a man rehearsing madness. He carried a spade in his hands, its iron edge glinting each time the moonlight broke through the curtains. His face was slick with sweat, his lips moving in whispers she could not hear until at last he spoke aloud. "It must be ready," he said, his voice low and reverent. "The earth must be waiting when the hour comes." Miriam's heart hammered as he leaned the spade against the wall, his hands trembling as though they longed to dig even within the confines of the house. She knew where he meant to go, and dread filled her bones with lead. She followed him as far as the veranda, the boards groaning beneath her steps, and through the shadows she watched him walk into the burial ground. The lantern he carried swung wildly, casting long, twisted figures across the stones. He knelt beside Clara's grave, setting the lantern upon the soil, and pressed his hands into the mound as though embracing the body beneath. Then he rose and drove the spade into the ground beside it, turning the earth with a fervor that was more devotion than labor. Miriam clutched her belly, tears burning her eyes, as the sound of soil breaking filled the night. Each thrust of the spade seemed to echo in her chest, as though digging into her own flesh. The lantern's glow flickered across his face, revealing a smile both rapturous and broken. He whispered Clara's name with every stroke, pausing only to murmur that the second grave would soon be filled, that the child would not be born to air, but to earth. Miriam's knees buckled, and she sank to the porch, her breath ragged. In that moment, the ground seemed to tremble beneath her, a shiver running through the soil as if it welcomed the spade. She shut her eyes, praying the vision would pass. But when she opened them again, she saw a pale hand rise from Clara's mound, fingers curling as though beckoning Elias onward. He fell to his knees, clutching at the phantom hand, tears streaking his face. Miriam turned away, unable to bear it, and fled back inside. The chamber was darker than before, the walls seeming to lean inward, the smell of dirt sharp in the air. She collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking, and pressed her face into the blanket. From the burial ground came the muffled thud of the spade, steady as a heartbeat, and the sound of Elias's voice calling both Clara's name and her own, binding them together with every turn of earth. She clutched her belly as the child moved once more, cold and sharp inside her, and knew with a terrible certainty that when the digging ended, her hour would begin. The dawn broke dim and colorless. The sky, a flat sheet of gray that carried no promise of warmth. Miriam had not slept, her eyes swollen from tears she dared not shed aloud. When Elias returned from the burial ground, his hands were black with soil, his nails rimmed with earth, his face hollow yet shining with a fevered satisfaction. He collapsed into the chair by the hearth, staring at nothing, whispering Clara's name as though the grave had answered him. Miriam stood in the doorway, clutching the frame to steady herself, and for a moment she thought to run, to flee into the woods, and never look back. But she knew the dogs would be set loose, the overseer's whip not far behind, and beyond that, the earth itself seemed to hunger for her steps. She retreated to the chamber, her body weak, and lay across the bed with her hands pressed against her belly. The child moved inside her again, not with the gentle stir of life, but with a sharpness that made her gasp, as though claws scraped her from within. She wept silently, knowing Aunt Ruth's words had been true. The seed was cursed, bound not to the living, but to the waiting grave. That night Elias summoned her to the parlor, where the broken portrait of Clara had been propped again against the mantel, its torn canvas fluttering in the draught. He poured wine into 2 glasses, pressing one into her hand, his eyes blazing with strange devotion. "Tonight," he said, his voice trembling, "we vow before her spirit. Tomorrow the earth will welcome us all." Miriam lowered her gaze, the goblet shaking in her grip, and prayed the floor might open beneath her to spare her what was coming. As Elias raised his glass to toast the absent dead, the house fell into silence. Every candle guttered low, and Miriam felt a presence behind her, cold breath upon her neck. She turned slowly, her body rigid, and saw Clara's figure once more, her gown in tatters, her veil dripping soil that spattered onto the floorboards. The air grew colder until her skin stung, and Elias fell to his knees in ecstasy, begging forgiveness, praising her return. Clara's face lifted, her hollow eyes fixing on Miriam, and her lips moved without sound. But Miriam understood. The vow had already been spoken, sealed in earth and blood, and nothing she did could unbind it. She stumbled back toward the chamber, clutching the bundle of salt and sage until it tore in her hands, spilling across the floor like ashes. She fell to her knees, trembling, her tears mingling with the grains, whispering broken prayers into the dark. Outside, the burial ground seemed to breathe, the soil shifting as though in restless anticipation. Miriam pressed her forehead to the floorboards and knew that the earth had already claimed her name, carving it beside Clara's, long before her body would ever lie within the grave. The night crept in with a weight heavier than any before, the air so dense Miriam felt each breath like a stone lodged in her throat. The chamber smelled of earth, though the windows were shut tight, and the boards beneath her feet seemed to pulse as if something beneath them stirred. Elias came to her, dressed in black, his hair unkempt, his eyes shining with a light that was not his own. In his hands he carried a length of white lace, the same veil that had once crowned Clara and then been pressed upon Miriam's head in mockery of vows. He placed it over her once more, his fingers trembling as he whispered words she could not bear to hear. "It is time," he said, his voice breaking like a hymn sung too long. "The grave is ready, and she waits for you." Miriam's knees weakened, her body swaying as he drew her from the chamber. The hall stretched longer than she remembered, shadows moving across the walls like mourners walking in procession. Each step carried her closer to the door, her belly heavy with the still child within, her heart beating louder than the toll of any bell. They passed the parlor, where Clara's torn portrait now leaned against the hearth, its painted eyes dull yet watchful. Miriam thought she saw the canvas twitch, as though the dead wife longed to rise again. Elias tightened his grip and dragged her into the night. The burial ground glistened under the moon, the soil of Clara's grave damp from the storm, the second mound beside it freshly dug, its edges sharp as an open wound. Lantern light flickered across the stones, and Miriam saw shapes gathered at the edge of the trees, outlines faint and trembling. She knew they were not the living, but the dead who had come to witness. Summoned by the vow Elias would force her to complete, he pulled her to the edge of the pit, pressing her hand against the cool earth. "Kneel," he demanded, his voice cracked and raw. "Kneel and bind yourself to her forever." Miriam swayed, her breath breaking in sobs, the salt and sage gone from her pocket, her prayers scattered like ashes in the wind. She sank to her knees, the damp soil clinging to her skirts, and lifted her eyes to the sky. But there was no sky, only the looming shadow of the grave, wide and gaping, its silence louder than any cry. Elias raised his hands like a preacher before a congregation, his voice rising in broken prayer, calling Clara's name as if summoning her to claim her bride. The ground trembled beneath Miriam's palms, a shiver running through the earth like breath drawn deep, and she felt it then, the certainty that the grave would close upon her before the dawn. The moon hung swollen above the plantation, its pale light spilling across the fields like a shroud. Miriam knelt at the edge of the open grave, the veil clinging damp against her face, her body trembling as Elias loomed over her with the lantern swaying in his hand. His voice cracked with fever, chanting Clara's name as though the dead wife could hear, as though she herself guided the spade that had torn the earth wide. Miriam's fingers dug into the soil, damp and cold, her nails breaking against the clumps of dirt that seemed already eager to bury her. The child within her no longer moved, and in the hollow silence of her body, she knew death had taken root. The women in the quarters had whispered that no bride in this house would see old age, that the grave chose its bride long before vows were spoken, and now the truth stood before her in the shape of a gaping pit. Elias pulled her forward, his hands tight upon her shoulders, and forced her to the very lip of the grave. His eyes glistened with madness, his mouth curved in a smile too wide, too broken. "You are hers now," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "You will lie beside her, and through you she will live again." Miriam's tears fell into the soil, vanishing like rain into thirst. She raised her face to the lantern light, and for an instant she saw them figures gathered in silence among the stones, the shades of the dead, their hollow eyes watching, their mouths moving in prayers older than scripture. Clara's veil seemed to drift across the night air, settling over Miriam's shoulders though no hand placed it there. The ground beneath her shifted, loose and restless, as if ready to close over her before the first handful of dirt was thrown. She cried out, not in words, but in a raw sound torn from her chest, and the lantern shuddered in Elias's grip. He faltered, his gaze snapping to the grave, as if something inside had moved. Miriam seized the moment, clutching the soil in her hands, and for the first time since the mock wedding, she felt a spark of defiance burn in her chest. She turned to him, her voice hoarse, and spoke Clara's name aloud. The ground heaved, a deep groan splitting the silence, and from the first grave rose a pale hand, its fingers stiff with earth, reaching upward. Elias screamed, stumbling back, his lantern crashing to the ground, its flames sputtering in the dirt. Miriam collapsed against the grass, her body racked with sobs, as the shadow of Clara stood between them, her veil dark with soil, her hollow eyes fixed not on her, but on the man who had bound them all. The night swallowed his cries, and when dawn came, the grave was no longer open. Travelers, who passed in years after, swore they saw two women walking hand in hand among the stones, one pale as bone, the other dark as soil, bound together in silence. And they said the earth still trembled when the bell tolled after dusk, as though it remembered the night a bride was given not to love, but to death itself. If you were haunted by this tale of the forced bride and the grave that would not wait, remember there are many more stories buried in silence. Comment the oldest graveyard in your town, and if you want more stories that linger long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.